Hello and welcome to Reforged Studio and our final instalment of our Warlord Titan unboxing series. In this part 5, what we're going to do is we're going to unbox the last of the big red boxes, as you can see here. And within this we've got the legs, some of the adjoining items, some of the bigger, chunkier pieces of resin, as well as some of the armour panels and a few of the other bits that we've yet to see from the previous unboxing series so far. After this, we're going to look at providing some of the how to build options, how to treat the Forgeworld resin, how to change things that we might not be familiar with. And actually from within this video you can see there's probably one of the worst aspects of this kit that we've seen from the unboxing so far that could prove to be a little bit of a challenge in terms of how we clean, fix and get that piece ready for assembly. So let's dig into it. So here we have all the pieces from within the box. As you can see, there's a couple of the bags full of some of the bigger, chunkier pieces and some of the bubble wrap bits. A few less bits than we had in some of the previous entries, but still quite a few pieces to dig through. So we won't mess about too much longer. We'll get all this put to one side and we'll start working through this sequentially and go from there. So we're going to dive right in. I'm going to start with some of these pieces in the middle in the bubble wrap. If we just dig through this is quite a couple of chunky pieces here, and as you can see, the reason for that is because these are the thigh parts of the Titan itself. Some quite big sturdy chunks of resin here, and that's because a lot of the weight of the upper part of the Titan, and even indeed the lower part, is going to go through and pivot through these two pieces. Straight away we can see that there aren't too many problems with them, but the eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that there's a couple of bits that we've discussed in one of the previous videos in terms of some of the flash behind the pistons and the pipes, as well as this sort of classic join line or kind of ridge down the centre, and it doesn't seem to go all the way around, but that's, I believe, where the moulds join together, and some of the resin sometimes just sort of slightly misaligns. Not a problem, because as you can tell from the surface, there's a big flat section there, there's a slightly raised area, that's where an armour panel is going to go. So we're not going to see too much of that, but I might decide to clear it up just for personal reasons. But behind these pistons, we have some of that mould flashing. Not a problem, I don't think. It should just take a little bit of clean up and really sharp scalpel to go around those and sort of dig those little bits out. But again, is fairly typical of this sort of kit where you've got raised detail away from the body of the piece on some of the Forgeworld items. And you notice there's a couple of sort of holes and spots, a little bit perhaps where air bubbles have been on some of the rivets. I don't think that would be a huge problem. I have noticed though on the sort of the join aspect though, on this resin gate here, you can see that's a mess. You know, where the resin gate joins to the leg itself is messy, and that's going to take quite a bit of digging out. I'm going to have to make sure I get that correct. And here we just see there, and on a couple of these sort of rivets here, that there's been air bubbles and they've not formed properly. So there's a couple of ways we can approach fixing those, which we will look at in another video potentially, but we are going to run through a build of this project, and that's going to go with gap filling and all those sorts of things that you would expect to go through with a standard build. Overall, this piece is not too bad, and I'm happy with it. So move on to the next one, and we look to have similar issues. Again, we've got that join line down the middle. It's a little bit more pronounced on this one than it was the last, and you can sort of see there's a greasy quality to the surface of this, as we've seen on some of the other videos. That's not a problem. It will need degreasing before priming, just to make sure things are a little bit better in that sense. Going round, generally this is a bit of a smoother piece, but we've still got some of that flash. And you can see here on this resin gate there's a much cleaner delineation between where the resin gate should come off and where the piece of the model finishes. Overall, that just shows the sort of the discrepancy you can get between a few of these pieces from Forgeworld, but we'll get these packed up and we'll move on to the next piece, because nothing really here worries me too much. Moving on to this next piece then, what we've got here is a really heavy, chunky piece of resin, and that's because this is the hip, the groin, the main join section between the legs and the torso. This has got to carry a lot of weight. This has got to support a lot of the model. To fix this, I'll be drilling, pinning, and resin, just to make sure that this won't go anywhere, and that takes quite a bit of care to make sure it doesn't slip while you do that, to make sure that we don't end up with a wonky Titan. But this is an incredibly heavy piece, fairly straightforward. It's got a simple resin gate on part of the model that we're not going to see, so even if we don't trim that up perfectly, things will sit nice and smooth and out of the way. Overall, this is quite a nice piece. Not too many problems. There's a little bit of that join line, doesn't seem to go too far onto the model whatsoever, just a little bit on the top, again on that sort of nubbin that the torso and the upper section of the Titan is going to sit on. A little bit of a ledge on the front piece, but again there's going to be an armour plate there, so I'm not particularly concerned with how that manifests once we are ready to assemble. So this piece, all good, no problems. We'll get it back in the bubble wrap and we'll carry on. So the next thing we've got here looks to be some of the arm supports, some of the sections that will hold the arms on the top of the torso. Again, like I say, most of this is legs and armour panels, but there are a few bits that we've not had up to this point. And this is going to be the sort of shoulder mounts for where the weapon arms slot into off the torso. No real problems with this. There's a little bit of a line around one side of this. The resin gate attaches quite nicely to the flat side of this model where it's going to attach. I don't have any major concerns, but you can see the size of these in my hand. These are quite large pieces. Again, they will need to be pinned and resined to make sure that the arms don't rip them off the torso. We see a little bit more of the greasy quality here. I guess there's a strong chance that when you've got this grease on the resin, part of the release agent, something like a Warlord, it's probably going to be sat in the packaging of the box for quite a while, so if there's any heat, some of that marks off the grease are going to, sort of leave impressions from the bubble wrap or whatever packaging it is they've got in. But overall, there's nothing seriously wrong with this whatsoever. Fairly standard kind of practice in terms of how you might expect these pieces to come out of the box. And yeah, we'll move on and we'll make sure that these go nicely back together and get them wrapped up. Moving on to the last piece here in the bubble wrap, we can see fairly straightforward, or the last piece you can see here, sorry, is one of the shin plates. Quite one of the large sort of imposing armour panels that we're going to see on the front of the Titan, as soon as you can sort of see this from any real sort of sense. A little bit of a greasy quality. I can feel, just sort of looking at this, you might be able to tell there's a slight bow on that right hand side as you see this. That will just need a little bit of heat treatment to bring it in line with the rest, but the resin gate appears to have gone on fairly well. There's a little bit of rough edging around some of the armour edging here. There's some roughness around where the resin gate joins the armour plate at the top, but it doesn't appear to have caused any major dramas, and I can easily fix that. Moving on to the next leg panel then, this looks to be the exact same piece. Again, fairly similar, all looks fairly straightforward, there's no massive misshaping, there's a little bit of that grease, the resin gate looks to have gone on in a similar way, there's a bit more flash between the pillars between the gate and the model itself, but as you can see, the easy way in which that's coming away, it shouldn't provide any real challenge in terms of cleaning up with a hobby scalpel or a knife or whatever it is you choose to use there. Fairly straightforward around the edges. Again, a little bit of a roughness you can sort of make out on both sides in terms of the very edges of the panel. The panel itself looks very similar to the other one in terms of there's a slight bending out on this right hand side. You can see that's probably what it should look like in terms of that sort of smooth curvature, but again, that will be fairly easy to fix with a little bit of heat treatment and then sort of dry fitting it to the model to make sure we've got it in the right space and that it looks correct. And one thing I don't really like on this could be a really nice big smooth panel, but we've got this kind of stupid motif in the middle, and I think that's just to sort of divide the panel up. But this could be a really nice one large sort of smooth surface type panel where you could probably put, you know, a transfer or something in the middle there, but that's not a huge problem. It's just a personal issue, I guess. Moving on to the next piece then. We've got what looks to be the upper rails for the torso. This is where the void shields are going to go. This is where we're going to have the kind of vents, or whatever you might call them, on the top front. You can see the dimples there for the void shield generators. Fairly straightforward piece. It's quite a sort of large, chunky piece of resin, as you can see. A little bit of sort of flashing and some quite weird scratching at the back here. That doesn't look to have been caused by any tools. It almost looks like kind of it's been attacked by some sort of animal, or it's been caught with some sort of tooling as they've tried to get it out of the mould, perhaps. It's the first time I've ever seen this, if I'm honest, on any of the Forgeworld resin I've ever had. I've never really seen this type of stuff, but where it is, potentially looks like it's been, you know, marked or something as it's been pulled out of the mould. That's a super easy fix. There's no structural damage to it. There's no kind of major problem raised by this. It's just not a smooth surface. You probably wouldn't even notice once it was painted and kind of weathered up and stuff. But if we look on the second one, again, everything seems fine. No evidence of those kinds of marks in the same place. So it's obviously not an issue with the mould. It's potentially, like I say, just an issue of where it's come out of the mould and has perhaps needs a little bit of coercing with a tool. A little bit of roughness around this, and some of the sort of flashing between the resin gate and the piece itself is a bit wild, but not in any sort of significant or damaging way. The next piece then, we've got the sort of skeleton structure of the shoulders. Anyone who's built a Warlord or has built an AT Warlord will know these are where the sort of main shoulder armour panels sit. This kind of sits above the weapon mount for the arm, and we'll get the sort of three main armour panels sat on this. Incredibly greasy finish on this, as you can see. The piece looks mostly smooth. There's a few little bits of flash, a little bit of slippage, but I've just noticed here there's quite a significant slip between the upper and lower part of this mould, as you can sort of see if I try to zoom in a little bit. That's possibly some of the worst sort of slippage I've seen on this particular model. I've definitely seen worse on some of the older Forgeworld kits that some people might remember. If, honestly, with how much I paid for this, if that was on a part of the model that you might see a little bit more readily, I'd probably have an issue with this. I'd probably look to talk to Forgeworld about replacing this part. Obviously, they're not going to replace the whole model like they might do with a Sicarian or another smaller model. But I would probably want this replacing if that slippage was on a part of the model that was immediately visible once constructed. Fortunately, this piece is going to mostly be hidden. I will still try and tidy things up. I'll still try and smooth things out as good as I can. But this part, actually, you can see there, this looks to have broken off the resin gate at some point, and actually looks like they've tried to sort of fix it back together, because I haven't glued or touched any of this in that sort of sense up to this point. Well, let's have a look at the second one here. Honestly, I don't think there'll be that sort of same problem. There's a little bit of flashing. I can see there's a little bit of slippage already, but overall, this one looks to have come out a little bit better than the other one. There's some slight flashing between the pieces. Again, that greasy finish. I'm sure we might get some part that I don't have to mention that greasy finish at some point, but who knows. You can see straight away the slippage on this piece is not anywhere similar to the severity of the previous one. There's still a little bit to fix. There's still a few bits to smooth off. The resin gate all seems to be fine. That hasn't really caused any problems. But we do have what looks like a fairly severe slippage line here on the inside of this panel. That's a flat straight edge. That shouldn't be a problem to fix, but again, if it wasn't covered by an armour panel, I would probably say something. given that you know this is a fairly expensive kit. But this piece, once the armour's on, you're not going to see it, and if you can see that, you're looking too closely. Overall, this side is not really as bad as the other one, but we'll package that up, get it out of the way, and we'll move on. And now we're moving on to some of the bags. As you can see, this bag is probably going to be fairly monotonous. This looks to be the ankle sort of armour joins that join the toes and the foot section between the sort of shin, the lower leg part, which means this is just going to be 8 of the same piece over and over. You can see there's some toes there as well. So this is just 16 parts of 2 of the same piece. Just copy paste really. This review might be fairly quick in this section, but the majority of this looks fine. It's fairly smooth. It's a curved armor piece with 2 ball socket joints to join. So there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of how you want to pose the toe. In terms of the flash, the bit between the resin gate and the bottom doesn't bother me too much, because again that will clean up fairly easily and will just slot between the toes, between the foot section and the shin section. And there's of course a sliding, again, anyone who's built a Warlord before, there's a sliding sort of section to go up and down depending on how you pose the leg or the foot and the toes accordingly. This will be, I think, a fairly straightforward review of these pieces. They all look fairly samey. No massive issues in terms of any of them. They're all kind of fairly evenly joined. There's a few rough patches around some of it. Nothing that concerns me. Certainly not up to the scale of some of the stuff we've seen up to this point. Some of that flash looks a lot worse than it actually is. So just kind of sort of speed review through some of these parts really. For such a small detail on this Titan, actually these are quite nice inclusion, in terms of these could just be kind of smooth sections of armour. You can see there's a few sort of raised pockmarky type areas. Personal preference, I'm probably going to try and smooth those down, because as you build those layers of paint, sometimes those little sort of imperfections can lead to a difference in how things the paint sits on the model. I'll probably just smooth them down, and if they go too far the other way, we can always flip into using a little bit of that stuff for kind of battle damage effect, chipping, weathering, oils, those sorts of things. The last couple of these now, most again look similar. There's a few sort of slight imperfections on the armor surface. That's just some really fine sandpaper, and a super sharp scalpel should fix all those problems for us. Last one then, again, fairly same. Flash in the same places, a few imperfections in the same places, but otherwise just a fairly solid, easy piece to review and get out of the way. Now the toes. These look to be, as we can see, fairly nice, fairly clean, fairly smooth. I do have a little bit of a bugbear with them, and that is with a lot of Forgeworld kits over time, sometimes you'll find the resin gates attach in a really kind of annoyingly frustrating place. Anyone who's ever built a Forgeworld resin Sicarian, for example, F for respects, those resin gates are in a bit of an awkward place. You can see here, this resin gate actually looks like it's broken off at some point and has been reattached in some way. But it joins on possibly the flimsiest part of this entire toe. There's a whole flat surface underneath the toe, underneath the individual toe there, yet the resin gate joins on the 3 sticky out pointy bits at the front of the toe. With how we clip these gates off, some of these, those little biddy sections really provide an opportunity that could be avoided for parts of this model just to snap off and fly over the room, never to be seen again. We'll have to be careful of how we chip those away, but I think we're okay. It's just a personal bugbear, and of course, who doesn't like to complain a little bit? Overall, the rest of these toes all look fine. There are no defects that I can see. There are no sort of issues or pockmarks or kind of resin where there shouldn't be resin. There's no holes where there should be resin, and kind of all those sorts of usual issues when dealing with Forgeworld. It's just a bugbear about how they've placed that resin gate. It just seems to be like the first one has had some sort of problem with how the gate is attached to the toe, but the toe itself is fine, so I'm not particularly worried about any of that. So the rest of this toe, again, like the others, is absolutely fine. There's a few little bits of rogue resin here and there. There's a little bit of flash you can just about see on the edge, the sort of side front edge there. And again, this one actually looks to be the second toe that's had some sort of issue with the resin gate attaching to it, but all seems fine with the toe itself. And the plan for the base on this means that actually some of these toes are probably going to get pretty much caked in crap anyway, so we can always pick the worst ones, worst of course being relative, in terms of how we want to dress those up with weathering effects, mud, grit, sand, rock, smushed marines, vehicles, whatever it is that we might want to add. So if we move on to the final bag now, as you can see, there are some big chunky pieces of resin here, and this is the last part of all of the thousands of pieces that there are for the Warlord Titan. So we'll get them all out of the bag and we'll zip through these, because as you can see, it's a full bag, but there aren't many pieces. There aren't many pieces at all, in fact. So we'll start with one of the smallest pieces. This looks to be the groin armour. As you can see, it's come off its resin gate. The part itself looks fine. The break looks to have been quite clean from the resin gate. The resin is sat above the level of detail, which is fine because we can always trim that down. What you don't want when those situations happen is if that level of resin goes below that point, because then you're into the phase of having to rebuild and fill. There are quite a few little pockmarked raised areas on this, but again, I'll just sort of shave those down. That shouldn't be any hardship whatsoever. A couple of seconds worth of work at most. Other than that, this piece is fine. We'll have a fairly central part of the front of the display of this model, so again, we'll just sort of treat this with a little bit of respect, but other than that, it's fine. These look to be part of the connective joints in terms of, I think, the weapon mounts for the shoulders, where that ball joint sort of sits in there, so you can sort of pose it up and down, move and twist it around. Fairly straightforward detail on this. There's not much to go wrong. The resin gate applies on the sort of flat edge that will be sunk to the level of detail of the other parts that it would slot into. No dramas on this whatsoever, just a couple of sort of slightly less than perfect smooth edges, but when I say slightly less than perfect, I do mean very, very off center. It's not a lot, but you know, it's worthwhile pointing these things out. And this, the curved sort of L-shaped junction of the lower leg joint. Interesting to see that the larger Warlord, compared to the AT version, comes in two parts here. This part will come off the resin gate and will sit on top of this, and this is what I was telling you earlier with regards to the sort of the ankle joins. This is where we've got the rails on that lower leg part, where the sort of the lower armor sections can just sort of run up and down this without any major problems. These two parts will go together quite nicely, and they will also form quite a chunk in terms of size of resin that sits supporting this Titan. The only defects I can find on this part are kind of within that sunken sort of socket joint part of this. The resin gate itself looks to have gone on fairly smoothly. There's a little bit of a line down the middle of that section. You can see it goes down the resin gate as well. No problem. There's a little bit of flash just sort of down the side and inside that little nook there. I think that's intentional. I don't think that's damage. So it's just a little bit of resin to sort of clip off there. Again, the second side of this looks fairly similar. No real drama. There's a little bit of a line down one of the armor joins and sort of into that socket joint, but again, fairly straightforward, this piece by the looks of it. A fair chunk. I'm just rubbing my fingers there because you can sort of feel the grease of these parts. And again, fairly solid chunk of resin. This is the lower leg portion, sat in that ball joint for the foot, with those sliding rails for the ankle armor joins. fairly straightforward. There's no problems with this that I can see. It's all fairly symmetrical. We'll move on to the other one before we, the other of the same part for the opposite leg. Again, details fairly clean, crisp, no dramas whatsoever. There's a little bit of an edge there, but again, if you didn't clean that up, behind all the armour, behind all the sort of ankle armour joins, if you saw that, you were just looking for problems, and I don't think it's a major issue. I, of course, will smooth it down, but you absolutely wouldn't have to. It could probably be left. The amount of times I've spent half an hour cleaning a part up to then put it together and realise I've actually just wasted half an hour of my time because you now can't see all of that effort I've just put into something. Marginally frustrating, but that's where we are. And then I believe these are the last two parts, which are parts of the top rails that we saw earlier with a little bit of that scarring on. These will go on the front or the back, I actually don't know from this point, and will sit with the void rails that we saw. This is a bit of an odd one because that actually looks a little bit like they've had to move where the resin gate applies to the model. It looks like there's been a bit of a failure of how the resin is injected down. It's quite a chunk, and from this side you can't really sort of see where that bit will go. This might be a bit of a tricky cleanup, and this actually could be a fairly good candidate for a video on how we clean up and tidy up decent chunks of resin off their resin gates for prep, because that is that's quite a chunk of flash. That's not just a little bit that you could score off with a sharp scalpel in a couple of seconds. That's going to require a little bit of planning in terms of chopping that off and trying to smooth it all down. The rest of the detail on that piece is absolutely fine, there's no problems. This one has got a bit of that flash between the end piece, but you can see pop straight out, no problems. That will come off really nice and clean. Quick score with a scalpel, that will come clean off. Not quite the same issue on this one that we had on the last one, but there is still that bit of resin, and you can even see what looks like a little bit of the mould itself has come off on the resin gate here. And that doesn't really affect us too much, doesn't impact us in the slightest, but too many of those bits over time are what end up meaning they have to redo moulds on certain parts, because if too many bits come off, it ruins the detail of some parts and causes problems. But for us, it shouldn't be a drama. That will just come off with the resin gate, and there we have it. That is the last part of the last unboxing video for this Warlord. The next step is going to be to run through a couple of the how-to cleaning and tidying of the Forgeworld resin type videos, but again, they will probably be sort of snapshots. And the real next big step is moving on to building. Leave us a comment in the thread if there's a preference for how you'd like to see this built, and if there's any other videos related to the Warlord that you'd like to see. But other than that, that's it for part 5 of the Warlord Titan unboxing series, and we'll see you next time.